Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. Let's talk about what to say back to unsolicited advice. Have you ever had that situation where somebody gives you unsolicited advice and then you're sitting there going, I'm not really liking this, but what do I do? If that describes you, you're in for a juicy episode because this is personally one of my favorite topics, probably because it bugs me so much. And I think, why can't people just ask you if they actually want your advice? So we're going to dive into what to say, why do we actually do it, and how to have a mindset around this, a proper mindset, I should say, to help you deal with people giving unsolicited advice. And then your bonus section here today is when you're tempted to give it, what do you do? Let's jump in. First of all, a funny situation that I had not that long ago when I was planning this episode was with a few friends over a Zoom call. And I was asking their opinion and their advice. Yes, I was soliciting their advice and asking, what is it that bugs you about when you get unsolicited advice? Well, a couple things. First of all, we feel judged. We feel people are making assumptions, which they are. They're making assumptions about thinking that they know better than us about our situation. And first of all, I think we can all agree that when people give advice, most of the time, people are doing it because they want to help. So here's the irony. Let me go back to what happened after that conversation. I was so fired up, couldn't wait to do this episode. And no more than 15 minutes after I hung up, Chris comes home and says, I need to find a bigger bag to put all of the stuff I want to bring to dialysis with me. And what do? Oh, you should get a wheelie. You could get a wheelie. Actually, I'm pretty good about avoiding should. So I said, you could get a wheelie. And he says, I could. And then having simply come back from a trip, I saw my carry-on bag right in front of me. Actually, it was his from our trip to Chicago. And I said, oh, wait, you could use your carry-on. Everything would fit in there. And he said, yes, I could. And if I wanted your suggestions, I would have asked you. I was so embarrassed. I thinking, oh, I'm so good at this. I don't give unsolicited advice. And it was such a good reminder that we all can fall prey to it. And I will say with great robustity, is that a word? No, with such great enthusiasm that it's definitely because I wanted to help. But there's also some undercurrents to this around control, but we're going to leave that and come back to that control. Hopefully we'll come back to that. I was going to say, remind me, but that would be pretty hard since I'm doing this myself here in our bedroom. Okay, let's talk about a reiteration of how do you feel when you get unsolicited advice? Take a moment to think about how you actually feel. Like I mentioned, other people have said they feel judged. They feel like people think that they know better about their situation. For me, it is a form of feeling controlled. And given the way that I grew up, I hate feeling controlled. Not that anybody likes to feel controlled, but I have an extra bent toward that when I feel like somebody is trying to tell me what to do. So I have spent a lot of time thinking and practicing the best ways to respond. So let's jump into that. But think first about, how does this make you feel? What to say? First of all, I would recommend that you thank them or affirm them for their advice. Now, let me qualify this a little bit. You're going to have a very different conversation, most likely, if it's your sister or husband or friend or whoever that you're close with versus someone who's a business person or somebody you don't know very well. Keep that in mind. And as I always like to remind everybody, common sense is very important to override anything that potentially you might hear as tips, because you've got to determine in the moment. It's often a judgment call. In fact, it usually is. Now, affirm and thank them. So, and then redirect them to what you need or want from them. So let's say somebody gives you what I heard a lot in some of the conversations I had before preparing for this or before thinking I would do this episode is people have said, I never got so much advice as I did when I became a new mom. And I am not a parent to human children, by the way, but I can only imagine that must be so annoying when everybody's telling you what to do. So let's say somebody tells you how to put your baby to sleep. And remember, first of all, it could be, oh, thank you so much for your advice. I know that you've got a lot of experience in this. I'd love to tell you what would be really helpful to me right now. Is that okay with you? Now, that's a great way to thank them. And also, it kind of wakes people up to realize that they're actually trying to give you unsolicited advice. Now, I'm giving you generic responses in general for as like the kind of the safest and most courteous responses that you could have. So again, you might alter some of those based on your relationship. So let's say it's your sister. Maybe you could say, hey, look, I know that you care deeply about me, but this is the 5th or 10th time you've been giving me advice about how to put my baby to sleep. And that is not something that I need or want from you. I'd love to ask you instead, if you want to give me advice, to ask me for what I want. Now, let's think about this in a business setting. Let's say somebody, you're new on a project and somebody perhaps has more experience than you, or maybe they don't, but let's assume they do. And they say something similar. They say, oh, you should really do this. This is the best way. I did this project last year and I want to help you. Here's the best way to do it. Again, hey, thanks so much. You've got great experience in this, and I really appreciate you wanting to help me. Now, if that were the case in business and it's a first conversation with that person, I would start with simply accepting that and saying thank you. One of the other things that you can do, and this is generally a really good boundaries piece of advice for you too, is to say something like, I really appreciate that feedback, or not that feedback. I appreciate that suggestion and I'll take that to heart. That could be a nice, polite way of just saying it and being done. If they keep giving you that feedback, you could say, you know what really works well for me when people make suggestions is to ask me in advance if that's something that I would like. Does that work for you? Now, again, you've always got to keep in mind who your audience is, if it's appropriate. But once again, most of the time people are clueless. They're absolutely clueless that they're doing this. Similar to the story that I shared when Chris comes home from dialysis and I immediately start suggesting suitcases that he could use. Okay. So we've kind of touched on this already, but most people don't realize they're doing it, or they think they're being helpful. And that's the really important thing to keep in mind. And that is what we've pretty much covered already, but thinking about what you really need and then saying that to them. Here's what I really need. Or does that work for you? Things like that. What do you think? That's another way to, after you make a request, to say, what do you think about that? And I really like, does that work for you? Even though in a way, let's face it, it's kind of silly. You're asking them to, in the nicest possible way, to not give them advice without actually saying that flat out. And then you're saying, does that work for you? But we've got to keep in mind with all of these things in general with communication, we've got to keep in mind some decorum, that we also want to keep the relationship. And I will tell you a big mistake that I made with somebody really well-meaning. It was a distant relative who had offered to give me a book before I went to Paris, some tourist book years ago. And I don't read tourist books most of the time. I like to just go to a city and explore. I'm not particularly interested. First of all, I don't want to carry another book in my luggage. And I knew I wasn't going to read it. So we happened to be out that day at a family activity. It was kind of an all-day thing. So various times we were walking around and he said, oh, I have this great book for you. And I said, oh, that's okay. Thanks so much. And then little bit later, oh my gosh, this place was so great in Paris. You have to go there. And he said, I really, this book is really going to help you. And I said, no, you know what? That's so nice of you, but no thanks. And then by the third time, I'm telling you that this was not something I was proud of. I flat out said to him, we'll call him Jim, Jim, I am never going to read that book. I'm sorry. Thank you for wanting to give it to me. I don't even know if I thanked him at that point. I'm going to be totally transparent here, but I definitely remember saying, I'm never going to read that book. So it was awful. First of all, I felt guilty about it and still do. And that was years ago because I felt badly for the way that I may have made him feel. Maybe he doesn't even remember it. I don't know. But I know that a family member overheard it and said, hey, you know what? He was really just trying to connect with you. And if you had just accepted it, it probably would have been easier and saved the relationship. Not that there was anything needing to be saved, distant relative, like I said, but I would have come across with a better impression of me, but also it probably would have made him feel good to give me that book. So sometimes we have to be careful. And again, I'm guilty of this, of not being this high and mighty person of, oh, well, I don't need that. And stop telling me what to do, because that could also be other stuff that we have to deal with. For me, it's that baggage of the childhood wounds. So of feeling controlled. But that is something to keep in mind about why we do it. So let's transition into that. So we just talked a minute ago about what to say and why do we give unsolicited advice. Number one, it might be not necessarily in this order, but that attempt to connect is one of the reasons. The other one is what we've already talked about, is people generally do genuinely want to help. They feel like, ooh, this worked for me. I want to share and help you as well. The other thing that sometimes is part of it is that we think we know better or best. This is where, when we get to our bonus section, I'm going to talk a little bit about keeping yourself in check around that. Do you really know better or best for this person? Until we've actually literally walked in their shoes, we probably don't know best for them. The other thing that Barbara Scher came up with, who is an author and one of the pioneers related to the coaching industry back in the 80s, she wrote a book called The Wish Obstacle Principle, or Wishcraft, Wishcraft. And the principle, though, in that book that I found fascinating is this wish obstacle principle. And the root of it is that most of us are problem solvers by nature. We are wired to be problem solvers as human beings. So we're naturally inclined, when somebody throws out a wish, even though they're not actually asking you for advice, they throw out a wish, like my husband when he came home and said, oh, I really need to find a bigger bag. Our attempt is to solve that problem for them. And it's usually not very helpful. But it's good to keep in mind some of those reasons. So we want to help. We want to solve. We're natural problem solvers. It's potentially our attempt to connect. And we sometimes feel that we know better than the person. Now let's talk about mindset around this. When you're getting unsolicited advice, the first thing that I would recommend that you do, especially if it's annoying to you in particular, is to stop and take a deep breath. If we don't do that, we might be tempted to respond, as I have many times, unfortunately, in an unfavorable manner that did not make me look very good anyway. So keep in mind that compassion is really important. Remember to assume good intent. People truly do mean well most of the time. And I'd say give people the benefit of the doubt. And this can come back to how you respond. Hey, I know that you just want to help me with this project at work, or you want to help me with the best way to remodel my kitchen. But what I really need right now is just for you to listen. Would that work for you? Imagine how different it would be if we spoke like that. Because most people that care about us and are giving us this advice in the first place really want to help. So it's our job as human beings to direct them to what we need. And if we can do that, we're going to have much better relationships. We're going to be more efficient with our communication because we're not going to waste time just sitting there nodding our head and listening to somebody that's going on and on about unsolicited or about their advice that you didn't ask for. So another thing that you can do if somebody does keep going with something, oh, well, have you tried this? Oh, what about this? To just say, you know what? I have actually thought about all the things that you're suggesting. What I'd love to do now is just connect with you, just have a conversation. And I want you also to know, so this, I'm going to say this too. I'll say what I would say, and then I'll tell you the root of where that came from. I want you also to know that I appreciate how much you care about me, that you want to help me, that you want to solve my challenges and my problems. But it's actually enough, and even more so perfect, when you are simply connecting with me, when you're listening, when you let me vent. That is so much more powerful than you making suggestions about what I could do differently. So those are some ways to respond. And I will tell you, after a long friendship with someone, I had a conversation with her about how she would be very much one of these problem solvers. And I tolerated it because I really liked her a lot, but loved her. She's a dear friend of 30 years. And I finally decided a few years ago to broach the subject and ask her to be more of a listener than a problem solver for me. And at first, of course, it was really hard for her to hear because I hadn't said anything for 30 years. That's embarrassing to even share here. But what was so great about it, and I did acknowledge that. I said, I've never shared that. And I know that it would have been better if I had earlier. But I'm telling you now because I know you care deeply about me and I care deeply about you. And I want us to have an even stronger friendship. So, what I need from you as a friend is to listen more. And it's really been fascinating over the years now, or the couple of years since I shared that with her, how, first of all, how number one, she really wanted to change, to be a better friend for me. It was amazing, her response. And isn't it great that we finally had the conversation so that I could give her that opportunity? Otherwise, imagine if one of your friends for all these years is not saying anything, but there's something that you do that really bugs them. That is a missed opportunity. So I'm really glad I said something. She really has been changing and adapting differently. And it has definitely enriched our friendship. So I want to encourage you to ask for what you need, particularly in these times where you do get this unsolicited advice and it's driving you crazy, because especially when we have friendships or relationships with people time and time again, and we have all these interactions, at some point, saying something is going to serve you rather than tolerating the situation. And it's funny because I can still feel her struggle when she's trying to solve my problems, or she'll start trying to make suggestions, or she will sometimes still make suggestions. And then she'll go, oh, wait, I don't think that's what you need. How can I support you? What do you need? And by the way, those are beautiful questions. This is a really good segue to move into what happens, your bonus section here, when you're tempted to give it yourself. Because we've got to, first of all, at all costs, please avoid the word should. Oh, you should do this. Oh, you should do that. Oh, if only you do this. Well, let's get rid of those shoulds above all else, because should in general at its core is a word of shaming someone. Like you should implies that they didn't, or they're bad because they didn't do it. And we could analyze that to who knows how long, but generally speaking, avoid the word should, because most people don't want to hear, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And I would always ask you to ask yourself, would I want somebody to say, oh, you should do this? Now, you might say, well, sure, occasionally, but It's better to avoid the word, eliminate it from your vocabulary as much as possible anyway. So what I would suggest when you're tempted to give it is to stop, pause, breathe, then ask yourself in those moments where you stop. When I say stop, I mean stop talking, take a moment to think, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, do I really need to give this unsolicited advice? I would also ask yourself, why am I doing this? And if you really, really want to do it, then ask permission. Say, may I make a suggestion? Or may I offer an idea? Or you could flat out say, I'd really like to give you some advice. Is that okay with you? Are you open to advice? Are you open to an idea? Those things at least give them the option to respond with a yes or a no. And then I behoove you, beseech you. What is the word? I beg you. If they say no, respect that. Don't try to slide it in later or have it be camouflaged as something else. Just accept it. The world is not going to fall apart if you don't give your incredible advice to someone. I know we all believe ours is the best. I can still remember when Chris had a stroke and he was in the hospital. And one of our friends kept texting me, you've got to make sure when he gets home to make sure that, he doesn't have bad foods in the fridge. You got to make sure he's eating healthy. And she was very passionate about this, telling me all the things to do in a text. And I'm not really proud of how I responded, but I was getting really frustrated. And I said, you know what? We actually have a pretty good handle on what to do. And I don't need you to tell me what foods to keep in the fridge for him. What I really need right now, and if you really want to help us, is to listen, ask how we're doing, and check in occasionally to see how we are. And the magic question that I would invite you to ask me instead of giving me advice is, Karen, what do you need right now? How can I best help? Now, again, I said, I'm not that proud of that. I'm not proud of that at all because I didn't like the way that I responded because it was pretty curt in a text. But I will say that if you can train yourself to say, thank you so much. Here's what would be most helpful to me right now. And that will make all the difference when you ask for what you need. And then when you're tempted to give other people advice, to say, how can I support you? What do you need? So let's do a quick recap. Okay, first of all, how do you feel when you get unsolicited advice? Think about that and then turn the corner around when you're tempted to give someone advice that they don't necessarily want or ask for. We had some very specific phrases in there about what to say, like, how can I support you? What do you need right now? May I offer a suggestion? And yet then when the other way around, somebody's trying to give you unsolicited advice, thanking them and telling them what you need. Remember why we do it. We feel we know better. We want to help. I would say ultimately we want to help. Most people want to help. And then from a mindset perspective, have compassion, recognize that people want to help. So that's usually what their motive is. And take those deep breaths for when people give you unsolicited advice so that you don't react, that you respond the way you would like to, that makes you come across well and makes them feel good, and you've got the relationship intact. And then when you're tempted to give it, once again, take those deep breaths and ask, do I really need to give this advice? And if you really need to, ask for permission. That will help you have even better friendships, working relationships, all the above. So those are some tips on the unsolicited advice passion that I have, and I hope that they serve you well to be able to speak your truth when you need to, and also be able to support other people in the best way that works for them. So on that note, I'm going to say good night, goodbye, good morning, whatever time it is that you are listening to this. And thanks again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.